It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Good day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks, our episode 9 of our combination of our combined version, where we put domestic Australian politics, media, etc., together with our world coverage. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. How are you, mate?
I'm good, mate. Starting to get a bit cooler here. The winter monsoon, as they call it here, will arrive at the weekend.
Well, you don't get summer monsoons just in the winter.
No, it's a winter monsoon, which doesn't necessarily mean it's wet. But what happens is that the wind turns around and comes from the far east of China. So it gets pretty damn cold pretty quickly.
It's a bit brisk. Yeah,
predicting at the weekend that the outer edges of the north of the new territories, which is up near the Chinese border, will be 5 degrees, and we might get by with about 8 here on the island, I think.
Wow, that's Southern Highlands temperature in winter. Here today we've got something in the mid-20s, a rather lovely day. I've been down in Melbourne where it was quite warm, and a whole lot of bad weather going on around the world. But you've got something there. You've read from a friend of mine, and he's I think he's got a special editorial role at the ABC, John Lyons, and he is talking about the relationship with China, what works and what doesn't, and he's saying that what Elbow does works, but Justin Trudeau, our favourite cosplaying political leader, not so much.
Yeah, at least Justin wasn't dressed in a Mandarin outfit, with the button all the way to the top or anything like that. He was just in a normal suit and tie. But, John Lyons, I think, is making a good point that there are different ways of approaching a relationship like the West has with China, and that Australia has, by and large, got it right back from the Gough Whitlam days.
Yes, it was an interesting piece, and he went back to the Whitlam days, and Gough, who had the vision to understand that China was going to become a giant, and an economic giant, and a major regional giant, into the Hawke era, and Hawke certainly, as Lyons said, was no apologist, but then he also identified, that's Lyons, he also identified a period from around 2017 onwards, which is the latter part of the Turnbull government and coming into the Morrison government, where the relationship with China was absolutely terrible, and there was a lot of megaphone diplomacy going on from Australia.
Yeah, John Lyons was very clear that that the good approach to China, what he thinks is the good approach to China, had been bipartisan right through, right from the Whitlam days thereon, but that seemed to collapse. And he was full of praise for people like John Howard and Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, who had all maintained this same approach, but that it started to fall apart during the latter part of the Turnbull government and the Morrison government.
Well, the Morrison government, the current leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, on Anzac Day this year, Jack, in the middle of a political campaign. Prepare for war, Australia.
Yeah, I think he's been reading Greg Sheridan in The Australian. Huh?
I would not agree with that. I think Greg is actually Greg's got a pretty good grasp with this, but that was really just playing domestic politics, talking to a domestic audience, and really having what Dutton said, really having no sense of the great diplomatic harm he was doing. Or not being concerned about it, because he was trying to make it an election issue.
Yeah, well, I think Greg Sheridan last week said that the time to prepare for war with China is now. I think that's right. You always prepare ahead of time.
I mean, are we preparing for war with China, or are we preparing for regional conflict, Jack? I mean, I think
Well,
that's
it's much the same thing.
well. Is it? I mean, do we perceive our national interests are most threatened by China and their expansion of their military, expansion of their economy?
Oh, well, time will tell with that.
Yeah, I mean, what I guess the point I'm trying to make is that where politicians seek to make domestic political points around foreign policy, it is always a disaster.
Yeah, unfortunately, they all do it. They do it in China and they do it in all around the West as well. By and large, they do it too often, but it's very hard to stop them from doing that.
Yeah, when election campaigns are on, Jack,
Yeah.
basically the gloves come off.
Yeah.
Now look,
But I think John Lyon made some good points. That
it was it was a good piece.
There is a better way of going about it than what he particularly called Justin Trudeau out for was briefing against President Xi Jinping post a meeting with him.
Yes, and that definitely did happen, and also the sort of megaphone stuff, Jack.
Yeah.
Yelling out through using the media to basically hold a dialogue with China. It's just not going to work, is it?
No, it just gets their back up, and you know, it's possible to have a sensible conversation with them.
Yeah. You don't just scream it out.
Which doesn't mean giving away our position. Doesn't mean saying, well, we're just going to go along with whatever you want to do.
No, that's right.
It just means you sit down quietly and calmly and say, this is what we think about this, and you listen to their response.
Yeah, and you don't go out and hold a press conference afterwards and say what's happened.
Or in Trudeau's case, leak to the media your version of what the conversation was about.
That is just not the way to handle very sensitive diplomatic matters, and I think our current opposition, Jack, is well, if they're learning, they're showing no signs of it. But it's probably, I would say, we can talk about this towards the end of the program or towards the end of the local coverage. I would think it's probably the best thing that the Albanese government has done coming into the end of 2022. And that is to put the relationship with their major trading partner back on some sort of dialogue, some sort of track where conversations can now occur between the two countries at a very senior level.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to be terribly exact about where it started to go off the rails, but it certainly was in Turnbull's time where it started to fall apart.
It was, yeah, and I think Lyons got that right. The 2017, rather than just the emergence of Morrison, and we know Morrison would have played, the diplomatic card or the foreign affairs card, and did, but the problem started well before that. And of course, there was no conversation. When major trading partner. And the trade ministers, well, the Chinese trade minister wasn't taking the calls, Jack, for about 2 years. It's not a good situation. So
we were finding out things like the importation of Australian lobster and crayfish had been stopped when the plane load of lobsters arrived in China and were left to rot on the tarmac. So that's a failure of communication, you might say.
Yeah, indeed. It did make for very cheap lobsters over Christmas in Australia for domestic consumption.
Every cloud has a silver lining.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to make too much fun of this, Jack, but we've seen some pretty poor behaviour around Christmas parties. There's one, a Victorian Union official has allegedly headbutted someone at a Christmas party.
It was a law firm Christmas party, I believe.
So, let's just start with the obvious. Headbutting is a really low act. It just is a very low act. I spoke to a police officer about
unless you're from Glasgow.
Well, maybe the old Glasgow kiss is acceptable there, but I was talking to a copper who for him it's like kicking. He might have copped one on the bonce himself, over the journey, but he said it was just about the lowest thing a person can pull. So we got a union official in there. That made a bit of news. He was from the Plumbers Union, wasn't he, Jack?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I don't want to go into this too deeply because there may be legal proceedings at some stage.
Yeah, and of course we've got the Sky News and man, it was about to take over the morning show at 2GB. Chris Smith, who's been stood down over inappropriate behaviour at the Sky News Christmas party. Jack, got a bit of history, hasn't he?
Well, I think he does. See, I
He's got
haven't
a lot of
followed his
history,
career
quite
very
frankly,
closely.
yeah.
Career very
Allegations,
closely. I've just got to say that this sort of stuff's been happening at Christmas parties for as long as I can remember. You know,
it's different times, Jack, and you just can't get away. Look, it's not clear what Smith has done, but clearly he has. Conducted himself in an appropriate way. I noticed he attempted to reach out and apologise today. He's not the amusing thing. There's nothing really amusing about this, other than he is now seeking treatment, Jack. This is a very Australian thing. When you're locked in a scandal and you're a public figure, all of a sudden you wander off to some form of recovery, seeking some form of redemption through therapy, through residential therapy.
well, we borrowed this idea from the Americans, I think.
No, the Americans go into rehab. They go into rehab.
You know,
we go into psychiatric counselling. We're very depressed. We become very depressed.
Distinction without a difference, but you know.
I know they put them in rehab where they keep them off the booze. Wherever this guy's gone, I don't know. He's got a long history of this. He was actually convicted of forgery many years ago while he was at the Australian at a current affair. And most recently, I think over about 10 years ago, he was involved at a Channel 9 party where he allegedly exposed himself. And there have been other concerns about his behaviour at I believe, a 2GB party. And sort of all was forgiven. He is a sort of loudmouth shock jock, Jack. So is this peculiar to loudmouth shock jocks that they think they can just walk into a room and just take it over?
I think there's a little bit of that in it. It's just something that some people suffer from. It's a seasonal illness, I think, around the Christmas party season.
Well, after one of his earlier misdemeanors, which saw him lose his job at GB, he said that he drank champagne and red wine and it made him manic and so forth, you know. And what's the answer? The answer is not just don't do it, you know. If you know you got to behave, and this guy, he's not a kid. You know, we could put some of our drunken behaviour down to the silliness of youth, but this guy's not a kid. He must know he's got a problem.
Yeah, almost invariably during the Christmas season, in my lawyering days, some young fella, and it was probably me a couple of times, would make a bit of a goose of himself at one of the Christmas functions. You're out there every night going to Christmas functions. It's part of the networking thing you've got to do.
Well, this was a particular work, and the HR person at Sky said, behave yourselves. Some level of decorum is required, but I think one of the points you make there is quite right. I mean, he'd been on the booze for what seems to be about 7 or 8 hours, and that's never going to end well.
No, that's the multiple Christmas functions in one day mistake.
Yeah. Look. Christmas parties, they have changed. The nature of them, you're talking about stuff going back 30 or 40 years. And they
were pretty freewheeling in those days, I've just got to be said.
But they're not now, though. They're not nowadays. And so they're not those sort of boozy affairs. I mean, look, I did see some of the photos on the Daily Mail, which was basically chortling away at Chris Smith's predicament, but there were photos taken by various Sky News personalities including Rita Panahi, who took a photo of the barmate and the booze that was available. It was a substantial amount of alcohol, and that seems to fly in the face of. Well, I'm going to say the Sky News. I'm going to say the Sky News Christmas party next year will probably be a picnic and BYO.
Yeah, quite possibly. People tend to learn from this a bit. Yeah.
Well,
Or don't.
what happens to Chris Smith now, Jack?
Oh, I don't know. That's a matter for the radio station. Oh, he's going to be on Sky News, is he?
Yeah, look,
It's a matter for Sky.
he's I think he's got a weekly show on Sky News. He was due to take over Ben Fordham's drive show in the Christmas break, and all that's been put on hold. I can't see a way back for him. And in fact, I think Rita Panahi made a statement today that she doesn't want to work with him. Andrew Bolt has said, yeah, go and get yourself better, but don't do it here. Goodbye, good luck. And it seems like at least the staff at Sky have spoken.
Yeah, well, if your teammates don't want to play with you, that's it.
That's pretty much it, isn't it? Yeah, look, it comes on top.
But he might go off somewhere else, and if you got the skill to be a broadcaster, he might find a job.
Hard to know where, Jack.
Will Kenya?
Yeah, well, I reckon the Will Kenya DJ they got there would be better than him. Look, it's just an awful story. Apparently, he copped a smack across the chops for his trouble too, according to reports. Whoever one of the women that he sort of accosted has given him a slap. For it, which he richly deserved by the sounds of things. So, yes, I would think it's the very end of Chris Smith's career, Jack. Convicted of forgery. That's a rarity, isn't it, Jack? Convicted of forgery. Do you remember the story? He was basically, I think, had forged a request to enter a prison. And I think the forgery came from his EP. So he'd forged signatures in order to obtain an interview with a prisoner and was subsequently convicted of that. So, morals.
So, overeager reporter, did we have one of those? Did it?
Well, you can't do it that way. You can't do it that way. You can't. I mean, get the story by whatever means, but they've got to be fair and don't involve a lot of criminality. We're just going to move on now to a discussion about excess deaths, which sends shivers up my spine because this is stuff that cookers have latched onto and are indicating that it is part of the vaccine. I have looked at the figures. The ABS provisional figures say that in 2022 there were 128,797 deaths that occurred by 31 August and were registered by 31 October. That's important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The number of deaths is 17% more than the baseline average. Now, people are getting very concerned about this. There was a bit of an article in news.com.au which was not terribly helpful. It was quoting an insurance person, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah,
an actuarist who was wondering about all of this stuff. The 2020 deaths were down. So these are statistical anomalies. How we describe them, how we can explain them is not immediately clear. But for example, these things, just to indicate that these things do go up and do go down, in 2020, deaths for that period were, I think, something like 1,700 down. Now, but this is 17,000 deaths, about 12.4 above the historical average. It would seem perhaps one of the reasons for it is that there's much more mortality associated with COVID than we had perhaps realised. We probably need to have a better look at the stats as they come through, Jack.
Yeah, look, they're a step ahead of us in the UK, I think, and looking at what the causes there were. And I suspect the same thing is going to be in Australia. I think the cookers, not for the first time, are on the wrong track. I don't think it's anything to do with the vaccine. It's to do with the lockdown and the slowdown in diagnosis of particularly cancer and cardiac conditions.
All right.
And it's the failure to diagnose, as we know with cancers and with some cardiac conditions, getting an early diagnosis means the difference between we can make you comfortable, there's nothing we can do, and just check in tomorrow and we'll fix this for you.
I had a rather heated argument on Twitter with some clown about this. I received cancer surgery during a lockdown. Right.
Yeah.
So in that process, I was diagnosed through scans. I was asked to undertake an MRI, which I did. It was a highly specialised MRI that really only a few clinics could make available. And really, it is to the credit of everyone that was looking after me at Westmead and Westmead Private, and also all the way up to the New South Wales Minister for Health, Brad Hazzard. I actually sent a request to him to basically, would the state cover the cost of this MRI, which is incredibly expensive. It was an MRI of the penis, not to put too fine a point on it, Jack. All of these things went extremely well. I mean, I had the surgery, I had my urethra removed, surgically removed, the cancer with it. So my personal story is one of utter success. Now, what seems to be the case, and we're now moving on to this Lancet report.
It's sort of different to what you're talking about. Is what they've discovered in the UK, at least, and they've got the figures in the UK, is people just weren't going to the doctor. So they weren't getting
that. Be the case, but I don't know. I mean, so basically, if someone's being treated for cancer, as I was, those treatments continue. Those scans will continue. You go and do them. Now, if someone's saying, "Oh, I've got this lump on my leg because of lockdown, I'm not going to go and see a doctor," well, whose fault's that? I mean, it's not as if the doctors weren't available. I mean, in this country, basically, during lockdown, that was one of the things that you could go and do, go and see your doctor.
Yeah, well, we haven't got the figures yet in Australia, but we certainly do in the UK. And the diagnosis numbers were well and truly down, and down to about the same percentage of the excess deaths we're finding.
But not all these excess deaths in Australia are down to cancer. I mean, they're actually down to higher levels of dementia. That's one of the big upticks. We're talking about two separate things. We need to separate this. And what I'm saying is, you cannot blame the state. You cannot blame a health department if people are becoming aware of symptoms that might indicate that they have an illness. We can go forward with the cancer thing, but they're not going to get treatment. They're not going for diagnosis, and they're not going for diagnosis. And whose fault's that? It's not the state's. It can't be the health department.
Yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see what the figures. The figures are already in the UK. We know what's happening in the UK.
Yeah, but I mean, what I'm saying is that you can't blame the NHS. You can't blame GPs. You can't blame governments for this. If people are,
I think in the UK you can blame the NHS.
Why?
Because people couldn't get to see their doctors. Doctors weren't doing in-person patient reviews. They're still not.
I don't know how you get on with your doctor, mate, but you don't have to, really. And if that person says you need to go and get a CT scan, or you need to go and get an MRI, or you need to go and get an ultrasound because let's say, you are presenting with symptoms that would indicate you may have a cancer. I mean, you can do all this stuff over the phone. And what I'm saying is that for the most part, you've got an aversion of people to go and seek treatment because they were perhaps convinced that going out into the public or going into a medical clinic where they might have to interact with other people might be considered high risk. Maybe that's an excuse. But if people are presenting with symptoms and then don't proceed to seek any form of diagnosis through the whole myriad of diagnostic elements that are available to them. Whose fault's that?
The lowest cumulative excess deaths in the OECD were in Sweden.
I mean, again, what does that mean? I mean, are
No
you
lockdown.
looking at this? Are you looking at this in December 2022? What I'm saying is, one, you don't have the data. You simply don't have the data to make that conclusion, to make any conclusion that somehow Sweden got it absolutely right. When
I'm not
basically,
sure. I don't think anybody got it absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I think the lockdowns, by and large, were wrong. They're wrong in China now, and we can see that they're wrong in China now. And no one agrees with them in China, but they were wrong when we were doing them as well.
I mean, it's just rearview mirror stuff, mate. I mean,
Yeah,
it's real easy.
We need to
very easy. And I take you back to February 2020, all the way to really December of 2020 and beyond into January, February, March in this country. There were no vaccines. We had a highly infectious disease running around the place. I don't know what else the public health response was supposed to be. I mean, it's easy enough to say, oh, no, we would have been fine, and because there's no measure for that. There's no measure for the mistakes that you would have made. There's no measure. The only measure we could have is a hypothetical on fatalities.
The reason we do rear vision mirror views of these things is not, in my view, to say, oh, X person or Y person was at fault. We do them to work out what went wrong so we don't make the same mistake the next time.
Well, let's stay in the review mirror. We had a pandemic for 12 months where there were no vaccines developed. And it was actually a miracle that within 12 months we did have vaccines. So what would you have done with a highly infectious respiratory viral infection running through a community? What would you have done?
Well, I think there were plenty of people who were pointing to a better direction, which was to have society move along as closely as possible to normal, whilst protecting the vulnerable, because we know who were dying.
All right, so where did that happen?
Elderly and the immunocompromised.
And where did that happen? And so when we were looking at excess deaths in Sweden, I mean, their aged care facilities were absolutely ruined.
Yep.
High levels,
as they were in a lot of places.
High levels, and if we look at various places in the United States, I mean, the notion that COVID is over is absolutely a nonsense. It's running rampant through aged care facilities in Australia right now. The notion that it's over and that the data is complete and we can sit back and have a long, hard look in the mirror and go, oh, gee, didn't we get all this stuff wrong? I mean,
well, I think we need to start doing that. Yes.
Well, I don't think that we've got any proper understanding. I mean, we're looking at excess deaths here and saying, well, we're not quite sure. I mean, why would there be elevated excess deaths and dementia, Jack? I mean, how can you attribute that to the pandemic?
Oh, I don't think you can, but I think you can look at excess deaths as a really good measure of how badly things are going. And the numbers were up.
But you're looking at one specific element, and that is cancer diagnosis, right? I've told you my own story, right? Yeah. I've just told you my own story. How I could not have been treated any better, and that was right in the middle of a lockdown in New South Wales.
Mm.
I could not have been treated any better. I actually got hold of Brad Hazard's staff and said, look, I've got a problem. I've got a really expensive MRI. There's only one or two places in Sydney that will offer this. And really, right now I can't afford it. And they actually wrote to Westmead Private and said, have this guy and we'll take care of it. And that's not something that was extended to me because I'm a journalist or I work at the Australian or anything like that. That is something that anybody can do if they can make contact with the Minister for Health's office.
What the actuary in this case is doing is not looking at an individual case, but looking at what happens across the whole of the.
Well, what I'm saying of that piece from news.com.au, the piece from the actuary there makes no conclusions. There are zero conclusions to be made, and basically in the quotes is saying, well, we're going to have to get some more data, and that's what we need to do. Right. Yeah. I mean,
And my point is that the data collection in the UK is ahead of us, and we know what they're finding. And I suspect it'll be the same in Australia.
but now we're talking about something that's absolutely separate. I mean, this is a Lancet study about cancer diagnosis, right? And they were seeing that cancer diagnoses were down during the pandemic years, lockdowns 2020, 2021, right? That they were seeing the number of people.
Cardiac diagnoses down. There's been a number of studies in the UK that their data is ahead of what we are in terms of pulling it together, and that's the conclusion they're coming to. Now, I think it'll happen in Australia as well. I might be wrong.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is that we definitely need more data on that. What I'm saying is the public health response to it's just one of those things that you can't do in the review mirror without at least having some experience of what you were dealing with at the time. Now, when I say people in lockdown were not noticing symptoms, so if you have symptoms of heart disease and so forth, perhaps those people weren't leaving the home. Are you trying to tell me that in the NHS, people were reaching out to doctors and saying, "Oh, we can't deal with you right now because we're dealing with a pandemic"?
That's exactly what was happening in parts of the NHS. Exactly right.
Where was that happening? I mean, where was that happening? I mean, we need specific examples.
People couldn't get appointments even with the GP.
Well, we moved into something called phone consultations and so forth, which would be adequate because basically you would be saying to people, you will need to go and get a scan. You will need to get some sort of diagnostic imaging done to determine what sort of problems that you've got. There may well have been delays at emergency medical centres, but in Australia, if you're saying it's going to be exactly the same in your view, in Australia during lockdowns, that was one place you could go. You could go and see your doctor. You could go and see a diagnostic imaging centre. There were no problems. There were no restraints on any of this.
Yeah. No. Well, I'll put it as plainly as I can. The UK are further down the track than us. They've got a pretty good handle on what's gone wrong. And we've got the excess deaths, and I suspect we might find at least part of those excess deaths are caused by the same thing the UK are finding.
But some of those things are not down. If we're looking at excess deaths, there are also particular problems in reporting, right? So when we are looking at deaths for this year, right, there are particular problems with reporting. There are in terms of the cause of death. There are particular problems in reporting that. So if we look at something broadly like dementia, for example, that someone dies of dementia, people rarely die of dementia itself, but that is listed as a cause of death. And it would be something like renal failure. It might be something like viral pneumonia. So what we're actually seeing here, the little bits we do know, and if we look at 2021 as well, what we're seeing is respiratory illnesses down, incidence of some cancers, not all, up, dementia through the roof. So I'm saying that there's probably a failure in reporting. There's a problem not a failure, but there'll be a problem in the reporting of the cause of death, and it is problematic as you would expect. It is problematic at any given time. Let's just take an aged care facility where a doctor pronounces someone dead, and the cause of death is this person's had long contact with dementia. Had suffered dementia for a very long period of time. But that may not be the cause of death. The cause of death may be renal failure. Heart failure.
Well, I think the Queen's cause of death on her death certificate says old age.
There's no such thing. It's not. I know that's House of Windsor bullshit. I mean, that's saying that she didn't have cancer or that she didn't have a heart condition.
But this happens quite a bit. Doctors are not going to investigate why a 96-year-old dies. They just die.
So deaths due to dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, were 12.5% above the baseline average in August this year and 18.9% above the baseline average for the year to August. So that's in that sort of 2021 period. This equated to an age standardised death rate of 4.2 per 100,000 people compared to a baseline average rate of 4. Deaths due to diabetes were 11.9% above average in August, Jack, and were 20.8% higher than the baseline average for the year to August. While the number of deaths due to cancer was above the baseline average in August, above the baseline, the age standardised rate of 12.7 per 100,000 people was below the baseline average rate of 13%. That's the ABS. So I don't see anything here. Deaths due to cerebrovascular disease were 9.2% lower when compared to the average count in August. There were 247 deaths due to influenza and pneumonia in August, which is 44% below the baseline average. We can understand that because people were away from crowds. Crowds didn't exist because of lockdowns, etc. Of those deaths, 14 were due to influenza, which would be well and truly down. Pneumonia, what are we doing in terms of cause of death there? What are we calling viral pneumonia? Is that the killer or is it COVID? I mean, it really depends on what the doctor writes on the test certificate, and that's it. That's it.
Yeah, but this is all fine details, but the headline figure is a 13% increase in excess deaths, which is unusual.
Well,
That's
we've got deaths due to cancer below the baseline average. Below. So we've got a large number of deaths due to dementia, including Alzheimer's. That's really strange. One, we need far more data. And if you're saying that what's occurring in the UK, much of which I doubt for a start, is actually going to be represented here in Australia, those figures I just quoted to you do not reflect any similarity in terms of instances of cancer.
We will wait to see as the figures come in.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I really get a bit annoyed with this kind of let's have a look, let's have a review of management. I think one of the worst things they did was shut the country down. But it's all in hindsight. It's easy in hindsight, but
there's a reason we do it. We don't want to make the same mistake again. And to be honest, we can look across the border and see what China's been doing up until last week, and it's easy to see that that's been an error, but we were making the same error.
Well, I don't know what other response was there. I mean, we were talking about a highly infectious viral transmission of a disease. I mean, you could say that there was
what I thought was right at the time, and what I still think is right. And we should end this conversation because we're not going to agree about it. What I thought we should have been doing at the time was protecting the vulnerable and as much as possible getting everybody else back to normal.
Well, there's lots to learn there. I mean, there's lots to learn just in terms of that. But in February 2020, Jack, we didn't know what the vulnerable groups were going to be. We didn't know it.
We did pretty quickly afterwards. We knew who was dying.
We didn't know at that stage. We didn't know. We certainly had no idea of transmissions and effects on children. We had no idea at that stage.
Well, certainly not too far off from it. Certainly in Hong Kong, we knew who was dying. It was the elderly who were dying. And that we certainly did. But I'm asking you to put yourself in February, March, April of 2020, when lockdowns were becoming the standard across the world, and saying, well, what did we know about this and how it was going to attack and who the vulnerable ones were? Because if we look at some kind of influenza type virus, what we'll be looking at is death rates among the elderly and among the very young. Now, that didn't come through COVID, the very young, that is, but we didn't have that data. We just did not have that information at the time. Oh, we had it soon enough to avoid the very long lockdowns that Australia went through.
Well anyway, basically, once we get to,
you're not going to change my mind, I'm afraid.
Once we get to a vaccine rate where we could basically open up, which is pretty much what Australia did. You know, I mean, there were problems with the rollout and there were problems with the vaccines initially. I mean, there were, not problems with the vaccines, but there were issues around issues around some of the vaccines causing health problems, particularly for sort of middle-aged and younger men. But once we got that rollout happening, we basically opened up. I mean, I don't know that you fully understand the sheer number of people in the country at any given time, whether it's in Hong Kong or in Australia, who suffer from comorbidities, who suffer from issues around their own health. And I don't know what those people were going to be expected to do under your policy. If you were going to come up with one, I don't know what you would have expected them to do. Just wander off, go back to work and die.
No, they were the people who should have been staying away from work, not the
where
whole of the
mention of
country.
this? Where was the mention of this? I mean, where could you have done this? I mean, it's simply not enough to say we got things wrong. And then just come up with no idea on how you might have gone about it, and other than to say, oh, well, we should have put some money into aged care facilities, because that's basically where you are at the moment. The rest of the stuff, people with comorbidities, people with pre-existing health conditions that might have put them at risk, those things are very, very difficult to know. Those things are almost impossible to know with people with heart conditions that are not diagnosed. So what you'll be asking those people to do, on what we understand of COVID now, is to go into the community and basically get ill, very seriously ill, and if not, die.
I think that the approach of protecting the known vulnerable and getting society back to work would have been better all round. That's my view, and I'm not going to change it. So let's move on.
All right. Well, there's the numbers, and we had a deeper look at them. We'll keep an eye on the cancer numbers in Australia, but at this stage, there are no elevated instances of cancer. There are no elevated instances of failures to diagnose cancer. There are, I would say, if you wanted to have a proper discussion about the level of CT scans that are being made available to people, and we're not just talking about people with cancer, but in all sort of diagnostic settings, then you've got a very good argument to say that people have been using these things a little bit too often, and that a GP will refer you to a CT scan when really your specialist would prefer you to do an MRI. And there are profound policy lapses around that encourage this sort of spate of CT scan places.
Because we bought too many
in. The government, the Howard government encouraged the CT scans to come in.
And if you're going to spend that money, you've got to use the damn thing.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's part of the problem. And that's something I sort of, when you see kids that are in their 20s and they've had a dozen CT scans, and they're not unwell necessarily, but they've had a dozen CT scans. They've got a fair amount of radiation in them.
Oh, it's a beautiful piece of equipment. You got to have someone going through it, mate.
Oh, I don't like MRIs, mate. They're terrible.
I'm not so good on the. We have the new MRI machine here.
I look forward to the new ones.
That doesn't mean you've got to get put into the tube. I'm no good in the tube, mate.
I don't like the tube at all. I had to have so much Valium. There would just about a global shortage of Valium by the time I'd finished.
Xanax they give me. I think we ran the whole SAR out of Xanax to get me an MRI.
My GP said take two and then take two and then take two, and I just doubled it. I got through what was hour and a half in the MRI having my penis scanned, Jack.
Yeah, I'm not so good with the confined spaces, mate. And that noise.
Well, I'm scared of confined and open spaces and heights, and then I really don't like being and depths. Depths are terrible too. Yeah, all right.
I haven't tried that yet, but they tell me it's not much good. Yeah.
Look, that's claustrophobia. I mean, popping the aqua kit on and down and going down there, scuba equipment, I should say, going down to depths. No, not for me. Thank you very much. All right, the Lemon case, Jack. The battle is going on in the media, and more so, it would seem that there may be an investigation into the police and what they were up to in the ACT. Certainly, the DPP, I believe, has called for one.
Yeah, I think the Police Association in the ACT have also called for one. Everyone wants an inquiry now, except the people who can call the inquiry.
which is the ACT government,
Yes.
and no one else. I mean, it's not as if the New South Wales government can do anything
Or the
about
feds
it.
really can't.
Feds, yeah. So what happens? What's going to happen is this is going to end up in, well, there is, I believe, a civil litigation coming from the Higgins camp.
Yeah, and the possibility of civil litigation coming from the Lehman lawyers as well.
That's kind of where it's going to end, isn't it? In a sort of civil bun fight, and it's sort of a fairly unsatisfactory arrangement all round for pretty much all takers.
Yeah, it is.
How much does this look like a run? I mean, look, we understand the context of this parliament, political staffers, etc. How much of this, Jack, represents a sort of run-of-the-mill indecent or alleged indecent assault or sexual assault matter? I mean, we know reporting of sexual assaults rose for a period coming into the early part of the 21st century, and then that's declined again. I mean, women, and there were better investigative methods, but still not perfect. I mean, these crimes are not being often investigated because we've got low levels of reporting again. Is this the lesson from this case, Jack? Don't report.
The lesson from this case is that the way the case was conducted failed, and a fair bit of the fault with that, I'm afraid, lies with the media. And to be honest, if this was a sexual assault that didn't happen in Parliament House in a minister's office, but happened in an accountant's office in suburban Canberra, it wouldn't have got the same coverage.
Yeah, look, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And we've talked about a number of journalists, what we might call celebrity journalists, Jack, who conducted themselves in ways that I wonder how they sleep at night.
Yeah, the lesson for me out of all this is if you want to conduct a trial by mob in the conventional media and on social media, you probably won't get a real trial. That's the choice that journalists have got to make.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. My issue I would extend that to say that these matters are very, very difficult to prosecute generally. So even if you had none of the media intrusion and none of the curiosity about the victim and indeed the alleged offender, these things are very, very difficult to prosecute at the best of times.
They are difficult, and I think the courts do a relatively good job, a better job than they did a generation ago at dealing with them. It's far from perfect, but they're very difficult cases to conduct hearings for. But once you put it in once you have a mob trial first, the chances of getting a real trial happen properly are pretty slim. So that's the choice I think the media have got to make with this sort of stuff is you want a mob trial, you won't get a real trial.
Other side of that coin, Jack, is that there was a huge amount of what the media would explain as a great deal of public interest.
Yep.
So yes, but I think absolutely you're right. When you get through this, it's that sort of early intervention of the media that caused a lot of the problems in terms of the legal process. Moving overseas now, Jack. The EU, it can't be bent.
I'm not sure I'd say it's bent. I'd say that it's a strange organisation, the European Parliament. It has a lot of people who are kind of ex-politicians from their own country, sort of failed politicians.
Most of them are anti-EU, Jack. The blokes who end up in the MEP or they're
and they get shunted
MEPs.
upstairs. It's sort of you sort of get promoted to a. In fact, the head of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, was a sort of a failure as defence minister in Germany. So they had to find something for her to do. So they sent her to the EU. you know. And
So there've been 5 members arrested in a. Don't tell me the Qataris are corrupt. Do too, Jack. Come on.
oh yeah, that
So really,
I almost
this is
fell
really.
off my
I'm
chair.
starting to open my eyes here. So Qataris have been involved in the corruption. Is this got anything to do with the World Cup?
I don't think so.
It's just sorry. It's a run of the mill Qatari / Emirates bit of bribery, bit of money passing hands with 5 members of the EU arrested in this, Jack.
Yeah, the Belgian newspaper L'Echo reported on Saturday that several bags full of notes were found at one of the MP's Brussels home.
Yeah.
After they caught her father carrying a large amount of money in a suitcase.
You can't do it in the brown paper bags anymore. You need a suitcase.
Well, the brown paper bag isn't big enough.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can't get a big enough one. And of course, the good thing about the round paper bag is it's reusable, Jack.
Yes.
But you need something a little larger for this kind of coin. So another scandal hits the EU, several bags full of money were found at Ms. Carley's Brussels home.
This will all play out in the courts, of course, and we don't want to jump in and make a premature adjudication, but it's going to be a lot of fun as it goes through.
Yeah. Look, yes, when the Qataris are involved, sure, you don't always expect things to be squeaky clean, Jack.
No, this is a problem through the Middle East.
It's a cultural problem. Yes. Well, at the same time, those in the EU would know that receiving bribes wasn't a cultural issue. That the act of receiving a bribe would actually be a criminal offence. Allegedly.
We would hope that a member of the European Parliament would understand that.
All right, yes, we would hope that's true. Sri Lanka's conditions, Jack, where are they now with economically, and where are they now? Has the World Bank or the IMF come to the rescue yet?
Well, the IMF's standing ready to deal with them, but the Sri Lankan government's still negotiating with its debtors, including China and India, etc. But the World Bank has said that the economy the Sri Lankan economy contracted by 9.2% this year, and it will contract by a further 4.2% in 2023. That's very tough.
That's depression. That is a depression. 9.2 sustained. There is no specific trigger for a depression in terms of economic outcomes or figures, but a 9.2 shrinking of the economy, of Sri Lanka's economy. Is that when they're talking about this year? I presume it's 2022.
No, that was for 2022.
So 2022, their economy has shrunk by almost 10%, and in 2023 it will shrink by 4.2%, almost half of that. And really, there's only just pain there, isn't there? It's just a serious amount of pain.
Yeah, well, they're moving in the right direction. For starters, the numbers are at least moving in the right direction.
Well, yeah.
The new leader there, Mr. Wickrama Singer, they're moving to try and integrate Sri Lanka into by trade means with India, etc. India, China, and other Southeast Asian nations, Thailand, etc. To try and kickstart the economy. And I think that's the right approach.
I think in terms of money owed, the Chinese government are running at around about less than 10% of their total creditors. But I presume some of it would be European money as well.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. We'll keep an eye on Sri Lanka. It is. I
would say my headline for Sri Lanka is that they're making the right moves. They haven't got them done yet. They're trying for a free trade agreement with Singapore, and they're doing something similar with Thailand. But they are on the right approach, and we're just going to have to hope that the the airfares come down and the rest of the world gets keen on travelling again because the tourism industry might be their saviour.
Well, that's just getting onto that. I mean, I was looking at this issue of ticket prices, and so actually, Jack, the reason why flights are so expensive at the moment is because of the increased demand. And it's not just compared to pandemic times, but you're actually looking at an increased demand from as compared to 2019. So there's a huge
and a supply problem, and that's because they shut down so much of their own businesses to survive, and you can't just turn the key on a 747 and say, well, we'll take it out of the garage and put it back to work. It all takes time to get that. Now they've got to re-employ pilots, re-employ cabin staff, and get the planes going, and that takes time.
Look, there's a little bit of time there, but the other big factor is cost of fuel, Jack. The other is cost of aviation fuel. And I was just looking, I think Qantas actually spent over $1 billion just in their fuel bills this year. So yes, we've got huge demand. People want to fly again, but it's bloody expensive. I looked at flights just to go down to Melbourne, mate, and just went, just out with the car. I think very, very expensive, almost $1,000 one way.
Yeah, well, I'm saving money. I'm the Greta Thunberg of Hong Kong. I don't fly anywhere.
Fair enough. Very good. Look, I've got to ask this, Jack. If we go over to the United States, is Trump finished, or is he just started to walk towards the I'm finished line?
I think I was reading the distinguished British journalist Andrew Neil a couple of days ago, and he thinks he's pretty much finished, and I think that's probably right. I had a good look at the voting figures from Georgia, and Georgia was where the Republicans lost their last chance of evening the Senate out. Their candidate, who was a Trump candidate, the former American football star, he's going to lose. When all the votes are counted, he's going to lose his election by something like 4%. But in the same state, the Republicans did quite well. The governor won by 8%. The Secretary of State won by 9%. The Attorney General won by 5%, and all the various commissioners won by a similar margin, 7 or 8%. So the non-Trump Republicans did really quite well. The Trump Republican did really very badly.
Oh, he was an absolute shocker.
Yeah, and I kind of think that sort of spells the end for Trump.
Look, I looked at some of the voting behaviour stuff in the runoff election, and Herschel Walker. Well, he pretended to be a police officer. Some this sort of feigned military career that he got called out on, lied about his. I mean, it was just a train wreck of a candidate. But some of the voting behaviour stuff, when it got to that runoff election, and the turnout was much less than it had been during the midterms, and so both Democrat and Republican vote was down in the runoff, but the Republican vote was way down, and that was really a reflection of the very, very poor candidate that he was. Trump was able to blame the wife on Dr. Mehmet Oz. I don't think he's able to do the same with Herschel Walker. So we'll see. We'll just have to wait and see. He's had a shocking 3 weeks, Jack. And we could take it all. We'd take it all the way back to the midterms, but he's absolutely had a shocker. He's had Nazis round to his place. He's had an anti-Semite in the case of Kenya Walker running around in his place. His business has been convicted on 17 counts of tax evasion. All 17, I think they were. So he's had a shocking time.
But more importantly, I think Andrew Neil gets this right. His status as a loser is becoming more imprinted on Republican minds. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Well, that was kind of where we got to with the midterms, Jack. I mean, basically, he was. I forget what he said. He got 9 wrong out of 230 right. He's never going to change, and this is why his candidacy will continue, is because that's what he does. That's how he makes money now, and it's gonna come crashing down when that ends, and it'll end either pre-primary or you reckon pre. I'm not so sure. I reckon he'll go to perhaps 2 or 3 primaries and then get belted, and then what's he do, Jack? Does he call electoral fraud? Electoral fraud on the primaries? Probably give it a try, wouldn't he?
I'm sure he'll have an excuse that's not his fault. I did notice that there was a Yahoo News YouGov poll on the predicting what will happen in the Republican primary, and Trump is on 35% with Republicans or independents leaning Republican. But Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, is just 5 points behind on 30%. Which is a pretty good number this early in the race.
What we're talking about there is name recognition. So essentially, that's why Trump looms pretty large in polling, particularly among Republicans. It's hard to know quite just how much of the Republican vote is rusted on. So there still remains that threat that he will. That if take his bat and ball and go home, and that might split the Republican vote, and less likely is that he would run as a sort of independent candidate.
But it's pretty impressive from DeSantis to have name recognition good enough to get within 5% already.
Yeah, Trump's figures among independents. Obviously not Democrat voters. It's not absolutely terrible, and that means they just can't win a presidential election. Can't win a presidential election like that. And the Wall Street Journal's been busy, Jack, having a slag off at one of their competitors.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that I think Trump will be gone before long, but this is going to cost the media a fair bit.
I know.
The Washington Post has lost 500,000 subscribers since Trump left office. That's 20% of their subscribers.
It's pretty cheap too. I don't know if you're a subscriber. I am, and it doesn't hurt the wallet too much. The WAPO, and neither is the New York Times. So they're actually quite small subs. They had amazingly large subs throughout the pandemic and throughout the 2020 presidential election. So they're coming off pretty big highs.
That's true. But Trump has been really very, very good to the mainstream media.
I know. Yeah, there'll be publishers in the business who'll be crying. They'll be, God, you're going to have to go down a different route. We're going to have to find someone. But yeah, look, you take Trump out there, and DeSantis allegedly boring, according to the Atlantic. You've got Joe Biden who could barely stay awake. I mean, we are just looking at a group of politicians who aren't interesting, Jack.
Or who don't make such great copy as Trump does. Let's be fair, he does make great copy.
Yeah. No, absolutely right.
I mean, you can if it's a quiet news day, have a look at his Twitter feed and you'll find something.
He doesn't. He's only on the true socials. But look, he is just one of those characters that it's like watching a car crash. You
can't look away.
You cannot look away. All right, what's happening at Twitter, Jack? Has Elon Musk gone mad? I get the feeling that he has gone nuts. What did he say the other day? That basically his accepted pronouns now were Fauci prosecuted?
I think that was right. I don't think he's gone mad. I think he's actually moving more or less in a good direction with Twitter. I think in terms of its business.
Let me tell you, I have got 1, 2, 3, 4 toxic-looking DMs in my. None of that. Never used to get any of it. Now this is all, sort of. Oh, hang on, I better go and do this. Help me manage my my crypto fund and all this kind of stuff. Never used to see any of that stuff. That's starting to pour in. I actually don't mind the content. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter these days myself. I actually don't mind the content that, even if it's sort of some fairly dangerous people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or what have you, just talking absolute shite on this. But the problem I'd still have with Musk is that he is really, firstly, Twitter looks a little shaky while he's there, and technically, but also he's in the disinfo business, mate. That's what he does, and he'll do it selectively. I know you want to talk about the Dems and Hunter Biden's laptop and all that sort of stuff, but the problem with all of that is we're not getting any sense of what happened around Brexit. We're not getting any sense of Russian bots in 2016 or 2020. He just doesn't release that. He only drip feeds stuff out that suit his political agenda, which is basically a right-wing, libertarian, boring, unintelligent sort of response to political and social challenges.
Do you mean the stuff that he's releasing from within Twitter?
Well, it's just drip feed. It's just drip feed stuff, but it suits his agenda. So the other stuff. What I'd love to hear from Elon Musk is, okay, tell me what you've done about Russian bots. Tell me what you've done about Russian disinformation, and you will know you will have access to these files, and you haven't released a damn thing about it because it doesn't suit his agenda.
I think that's probably right. I think he is choosing what he released. He wants to make an impact, I think.
Yeah. Hang on. Yeah. So we're just.
People are getting well overexcited about all that's happening on Twitter. The Twitter numbers are pretty good. They're holding up. In fact, they're increasing. That's the number of engagements from people. I don't get all that excited about the Hunter Biden laptop or who from the Democratic National Party was contacting Twitter and asking for this or that to happen. I just don't think that's terribly interesting.
Some people are, though.
Yeah, I know. People are getting well and truly overexcited about this. The only thing that's a little bit interesting is the involvement of FBI briefings. Now, I think that ought to be looked at by the US government at some stage as to whether that was appropriate. But even that's not a really big issue. The big issue is, can he make money out of Twitter?
That's it. That's it. And look, he can probably even afford the loss if it happens, but a complete and utter destructive loss if it happens. But yes, the FBI. I mean, did the FBI actually? Has he got evidence that the FBI actually briefed Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and so forth?
There seems to be, and indeed, Mark Zuckerberg said that was happening with Meta or Facebook as well. And it's a little bit unclear as to exactly what was said and when, but that's something that's worth looking at. But the rest of it, I don't really care too much about it. One thing I did find was really quite amusing. There was a tweet by a chap who calls himself John Dean, and he says, "I'm looking for a lawyer or a law firm that will file a class action against Musk. For many of us who were here long before he arrived, he has ruined Twitter in too many ways to explain in a tweet." And the third comment in response to that was, John Dean would do it himself, but he was disbarred after pleading guilty to a felony count of obstruction of justice relating to the Watergate cover.
Did he do it? He actually he assisted prosecutors, didn't he? Did he end up in jail? Did he do it?
No, I don't think he did, but I think he's long dead. I think it's perhaps not the same John Dean.
Well, if he's died recently, Jack, because he became a bit of an MSNBC person.
Did he?
Very, very heavily. He's still around. He's 84.
I don't think he's tweeting, though.
I don't think he's doing the tweets, no. Or Dick confused me a little bit there because he was sort of politically active. He's a rhino.
A Republican in name only.
No, that's not right. No, he's a never Trumper. That's the best term. He was quite pronounced about it. Look, the trouble with Twitter, and as is the case with all social media, Jack, is that it's the people themselves who contribute the content. And so when we get to this point about whether we charge people for using, imagine charging people to use Facebook. Imagine charging people to use Twitter. This whole idea of blue ticks, money for blue ticks, and all that sort of stuff, it's not going to work, because it's the people themselves who provide the content, and Twitter is really just the forum for it. And that's why this, pay to post is just ridiculous stuff. It's just completely counter to really any sort of basic economics or basic sort of idea of trading. So that's where he's going to come across. That's where he's going to.
My hunch is he'll make some money out of it, but that's only a hunch.
Yeah, my hunch is that basically the revenue will dry up because there's too much disinformation there, and then there's no way to make money out of it. But he can afford the loss. What about Harry and Meghan? See, now look, we did ask you, Jack, to provide a detailed report on the Harry and Meghan show on Netflix, Jack. Now, have you got that? You watched it all? Have you watched it all yet?
No, well, I watched a fair bit of it.
Did you really? How long did you get in there in minutes?
I'm not going to fess up to minutes, but my wife had it on, and I was kind of half watching it, and I watched a little bit more because I thought I should, just to keep you informed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly boring documentary, it's fair to say.
These people are in pain, Jack.
Yeah, the best comment I saw on it was it's basically several hours of whining by two extremely privileged and wealthy narcissists living a life of tremendous luxury. And that's about it,
Look, if there's must-watch TV, it's very rich people complaining about their lives. I mean, good Lord.
Yeah, but you've got to say, for a very boring documentary, look at all of the column inches that have been written on it.
I know.
Look at all of the television coverage, etc., etc. It's been a great branding and marketing exercise. They'll be writing books about this in the future. Well, how do you get such great coverage of such a boring documentary?
Well, we also had the 82-year-old lady of the bedchamber getting involved in some racist stuff, and that I just thought the timing of that. I'm not suggesting anything contrived, but the timing
she's on a sling?
No. But the timing of that was superb for this particular documentary. Inadvertent, I'm sure, but the issue is, I mean, I look at this every week. Who's the biggest pool of all stories? And when we talk about Donald Trump contributing a lot of money, he was well down the pack this time. And guess what was at the top?
Oh, would it be what do they hear it described of us as the Woko Mono show? The best description, the best little clip from it that I thought, and this was picked up by one of the Nine newspaper journalists who said, it's hard not to eye roll at a tense scene in a chauffeured car when the couple allege they are being followed by a paparazzi photographer who is never filmed by the cameras they invited to film their invasion of the photographers. It gets so postmodern, one head hurts. And that was the highlight of it for me, I've got to say.
Oh, look, they've actually had to snip some footage from other unrelated incidents because they couldn't come up with the footage that they wanted to make their points. Anyway, I feel sorry for them, Jack, as we all should. And perhaps we should start a crowdfund and we all start throwing some money at these people because that's the only thing they seem to understand.
Yeah. But anyway, so I think as a marketing exercise, it's brilliant. The question remains for the future for them. Do they end up like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson, and just kind of fade away into a sort of an A- or B+ level of celebrity?
Well, look. To be honest, the old Edward VIII, he was an old school racist from way back, wasn't he? They gave him the governorship of the Bahamas. He threatened to turn. Well, he did actually for a while turn the water off to some of the islands, and didn't worry that only black people live there. All right, let's move on to sport, Jack. And there's plenty happening. We have the Final Four in the FIFA World Cup, and
Yeah.
there's two just burst out of nowhere, and you got to take your hat off to them: Morocco and Croatia.
Well, Croatia were pretty good in the last World Cup. I think they
Semi-finalists,
didn't they get to the
though. So
final?
yeah. I mean, look, they are a very, very, very good side in terms of defensively a great side. So are Moroccans actually. The Moroccans are basically
And the Brazilians are downhill skiers, always have been. They are great when things are going good for them, but they've lost 4 of their last 5 World Cup quarterfinals every time to a European team, because the European teams have got more grit and will keep going when things are tough, and the Brazilians just don't.
Well, Neymar dedicated his first goal of the World Cup tournament to Jair Bolsonaro, Jack. So
Yeah.
I just reckon he's copped his right whack.
Anyway, look, it's been a great World Cup. The football's been terrific.
It has been a great tournament. Shame about the venue, but it has been a fantastic and an enthralling tournament where I think a lot of people who don't often watch soccer, as FIFA calls it, that's one of my lines that I like to use. I've been watching a hell of a lot of it, myself included. The Brazilians. Shall we have just a quick moment of silence for England, Jack?
Look, they were pretty good. A chap in The Guardian got it right when he said that they played really well and they probably were on top of France in a lot of aspects of the game. But what France were good at was just taking the big moments. And as we know, you and I both know from big sport, it's the big moments that win you the match.
But the Kane penalty, Jack. Oh.
Have you seen the little meme that's going around on Twitter where they've superimposed Harry Kane's head over Johnny Wilkinson on the basis that they both got it over the crossbar?
It's just gone that fraction too high. And of course, the story is that he was kicking that penalty. It wasn't a penalty shootout. Sure, all our listeners know that it was an awarded penalty, and he was kicking to his Tottenham Hotspur goalie.
I think that's right. Yeah,
and so you'd think let someone else take it, mate, because this bloke's going to know some of your tricks.
And he didn't even make the goalie do any work. He put it straight over the crossbar.
Yeah, well, again, very easy in hindsight. Perhaps shouldn't have taken that penalty. Would have. It was quite late in the game too, so it would have probably pushed the game into extra time, and from there you never know. But the French looked very good, Jack. They looked deep. The great Mbappe was not so great in this particular game, so he's probably got something left for the semi and maybe the final. Who plays in the final?
Look, I think the French and the Argentinians.
It would be about right. So you've got that, in terms of the story, I mean, it'd be wonderful if Morocco made it through, for example, or Croatia, because that would be a story in itself, giant killers, all that sort of stuff. But yes, we've got Lionel Messi in his last game of representative football, international football, probably the greatest player of his generation, if not the greatest of all time. And
he's looking a bit old and slow at times, but every now and again, the pass for the first goal was just sublime.
Yeah.
Only he could have done that.
It would be very nice to see him go out in a World Cup final. I think France are just too talented, too deep, and we'll get the job done. But we will see. Look, I want to talk about this sort of nonsense with Dave Warner, Jack. We've talked about him. We've sung his praises. We think he's a great player. What is going on there? Why can't Cricket Australia just make an announcement and say, yeah, he can be in the leadership group, he can be captain, he can be vice captain? What is going on here?
Because they've been caught up in this process nonsense, that they've got to have a proper process. There's somebody called Sport Integrity Australia, and they've made some suggestions, and Cricket Australia feels duty bound to follow their template. Really, it should be a quick board meeting that says, okay, is the boy from the suburbs, is Davey going to be able to captain? Yes, done. Announcement.
It's extraordinary sort of stuff. Look, also his manager made it clear that during the week, Jack, that they were in the dressing rooms. So we're talking about Cricket Australia, unnamed executives in the dressing rooms, and there was talk there. Well, we can't beat South Africa unless we can get the ball to reverse, and that there was an agreement. Certainly an acceptance that the ball had needed to be tampered with in order for it to reverse.
I don't think this is news to anybody who follows cricket at all closely. That if you're getting beaten by someone who's reversing, then you're going to be trying to do the same thing yourself.
And ball tampering to do it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of outrage. There was just a lot of outrage when it happened in the Sandpaper Gate. I mean, it's absolute crap. Good players and well-respected players have been having a bit of a fiddle with the ball for a very long time. And it was just leapt on by idiots like Jeff Kennett, Peter Fitzsimons, who demanded that everyone involved in this never be allowed to play cricket ever again, not even the backyard.
And the then Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, it's very clear to me that he got on the blower to Cricket Australia and forced, but made it clear that he did not want to see Steve Smith captain for the rest of the game. And that ultimately happened. Jack, science, or it's a kind of science, isn't it, Jack? There's been unearthed, and I'm not quite sure where this has happened, but
in Turkey.
In Turkey, it's been unearthed a figure of a man holding his penis. That's not Chris Smith, is it?
I don't think Christmas is quite that old.
It's old enough. He's old enough to know better, Jack. Anyway, yes.
And it isn't clear whether this sculpture was based on a Christmas party, I can tell you.
It looks like, look, I am looking at a photograph of it now, and it looks like some kind of devil here, Jack. So devil doing devilish stuff, which is basically having one off the wrist. And how old is this? How far does this go?
It's 11,000 years old, so it certainly wasn't at a Christmas party.
It certainly was not at a Christmas party. Excellent work there, Jack.
Just before we go, the nicest thing I saw on the internet all week was Neil Diamond, who's 81,
right,
and retired in 2018. He cancelled a tour of Australia and New Zealand because he had Parkinson's disease. Has Parkinson's disease. They've written a stage show, a musical stage show. It's on Broadway at the moment. It's called A Beautiful Noise. And the opening night, at the end of the show, up stands Neil Diamond. He's in one of the boxes in the lovely theatre in Broadway, and he belts out "Sweet Caroline."
Oh, Swannies fans would have loved it too.
And so the audience were all on their feet. And as you would expect, when it got to the point where good times never been so good, they've all got one arm in the air saying, "So good, so good, so good."
Oh, isn't that nice?
Wouldn't have been a dry eye in the house. I don't think it was.
Look, not just the SCG, the Swannies. That song is a huge hit with Swans fans, but they play it around the grounds around the country during a lot of sports breakups.
All around the world, this happens.
I hope he's getting a check. From that. Yes, all right. Excellent story. Thank you for that. Look, we just remind our listeners as we wrap that we'd love to hear from you. We got some good notes during the week. We got some good feedback. We'd just like to hear it. We don't have to raise it to you, but we got some good feedback, which means we sort of, we know we're being listened to, and we like to hear that. But we also remind you that if you've got any questions, any queries, any criticisms, or indeed any pats on the shoulder for Jack or myself, just drop us a line. When my Twitter DMs are not being infested with spam, Elon Musk dangerous spam, then you can drop me a line there. I'll weed out the rubbish and get to your stuff, or you can drop us a line at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. Thanks again for your attendance here today, Jack. Go back to your cold winter monsoon.
Yeah, and any of the listeners who want to have a crack at me and tell me how terrible I am at all this, you just go right ahead.
He loves it. He actually loves it. I think he's a bit of a masochist streak.
Well, I'll be pulling the palings off the back fences and starting a fire in the lounge room. I think that's going to be so cold. Yeah.
You'll get the heater out tonight. I'm guessing. Yes. Look, this will go to air with pretty much the semi-finals almost done and dusted in the World Cup. So we wish the semi-finalists all the very, very best, and look forward to what the final on Saturday, Jack. And I think they still do that third versus fourth to see who finishes there.
That's on the Saturday, and the finals on the Sunday.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Good on you, mate. We'll talk to you again next week.
Will do.
Thanks, listeners. See ya.